Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this conversation with Sara Jensen Carr. I am Joe Waters, the co-founder and CEO of Capita, and it's great to have you all with us. Dr. Carr is joining us from just outside of Boston. She is a professor of architecture at Northeastern University. And Dr. Carr, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
I will note that we are recording today's conversation so that you will be able to reference it in the future. And we also will have a Q&A with Dr. Carr here shortly. And so I would invite you to use the Q&A function in the chat box to ask your questions, and feel free to chat with one another in the chat box. It's always good to hear and to see where people are joining us from and who you are. So please don't be shy. With that, we're going to start our conversation with Dr. Carr, and I'm going to ask what might be an unnecessarily provocative question, but Dr. Carr, does COVID spell the end of the life of the city?
So I would have to say absolutely not, but any crisis is definitely a time to reflect on how we change policy, right? And especially in my area, how do we rethink the built environment? And that's everything from our streets to our parks and open space to our buildings. And so this is not the end of the cities, but it is interesting to note that as I found out when I was researching my book, which is coming out next year, is that cities have for a long time been cast as the incubators of disease, and that dates back to the cholera and yellow fever outbreaks after the Industrial Revolution, to the respiratory diseases of the early 1900s, all the way up to thinking of the crisis of the cities that we had in the mid-century. And it's only been until recently, at least in my particular field, that we've seen cities as a real opportunity, and maybe even healthier, right? Because they offered maybe more walkability, right? Easier access to jobs and more amenities. So it's only been recently the tide was turning a little bit, but I think what this shows is it doesn't take much, although we are dealing with a lot right now, to tip the scales back to this discussion of our cities over. But the fact is like cities have always come back after crises like these, and particularly health crises. But hopefully they look a little bit different and for the better in the long run.
Great, wonderful. So let's dig into that book a little bit. It's forthcoming,
yes.
But boy, how about a well-timed book?
I was actually it was in final editing. So and now I'm wresting it back from the copy editor so I can add a hefty epilogue.
I can only imagine. So tell us about the premise of the book.
Sure. The premise of the book, and the book's called The Topography of Wellness, and it'll be coming out early next year. But I was really interested in how our urban landscapes had been formed by past illnesses, and maybe in some cases how urban landscapes had played a part in incubating other diseases. And so it's really the two parallel narratives of different types of urban landscapes and diseases. So starting back to thinking about how cholera and yellow fever during the Industrial Revolution really changed the design of our streets, to outbreaks of respiratory diseases in the early 1900s, and how that played a part in the building of large urban parks in Chicago and New York and Boston, particularly Central Park. Thinking about tuberculosis and modernism and vaccines, and that sort of medical thinking and its influence on modernism and public housing. And then all the way up to thinking about, what I would say were the chief issues we were thinking about in terms of the built environment of health pre-pandemic. And I think it's important to remember that, these are health issues we're going to still be facing even after the pandemic passes, and looking at, increasing suburban sprawl across the United States and its relationship to climate change and obesity-related diseases.
So I'm not an architect. I'm not an urban designer. I'm curious, how did epidemics impact the design of streets?
So, if we think about the origins of cities, if you think about early cities in the United States, imagine a place where there was no municipal waste removal, right? There was no oversight into how housing was built. There was no oversight into what factories were doing with their waste. And this is even a time where slaughterhouses were still built in the middle of cities. And so everybody was just sort of responsible for dumping their own waste in the streets, sometimes in the nearest water body they could find. When we think about housing, there were people just stacked on top of each other because everybody was moving from agricultural areas into the city for the jobs. What happened as a result of this was, of course, outbreaks of what we call filth diseases, so cholera and yellow fever. And what happened, because nobody really knew the cause of it at the point, they thought it could be coming from the air, they thought it could be coming from contaminated water that you were ingesting, and that happened to be the cause. But again, nobody knew really where it was coming from. What it did was it really transformed our cities, buildings, and streets, because the forces of urban planning and public health came together to reshape the city, namely by installing sanitary infrastructure underneath the streets. So large pipes underneath the water, because everybody just wanted to get the water out of the streets. They didn't want any stagnant bodies of water, because they were afraid the stench that would emanate from them was making people sick. And so to install sanitary infrastructure under streets, you had to tear all of them up. Streets became wider, they became smoother. I found an account of one man that was advocating against cobblestones because he was worried the space in between the cobblestones would hold the germs that made people sick. At the same time, it was also spurred on a large movement to put sanitary infrastructure within buildings. And so personal bathing, right? There was, just like now, there's a big push for people to wash their hands and bathe every day. And of course, this is on a much wider scale, right, than we have now. But that disease, and I think those diseases, and the fact that they were very much unknown, was really the first step in transforming our cities as we know them today.
So I'm particularly interested in the rapid urbanization of some parts of the world, and what that rapid urbanization might mean for the management of disease, but certainly for public health generally. And I heard a statistic several years ago that there are many cities in parts of the world that haven't been built yet. There's actually an opportunity, right, to build cities with a child-focused lens, with a public health-focused lens, with certainly a green lens, because people are moving to cities. New cities are going to need to be built. Can you tell us, like, just thinking ahead, if we were to imagine the design of a city 20, 30, 40 years from now, with an opportunity to build it from the ground up, what are the types of things that we would be doing now to ensure that city is both, conducive to promoting public health, but also to managing disease and, frankly, epidemics and pandemics?
Yeah, I think, in the face of any kind of rapid urbanization, people concentrate, understandably, so much on the capital, which they think comes from buildings, right? So you're building as many homes as possible, you're building as many office buildings as possible, you're thinking about industry. And I think that's what led us to an urban landscape in much of the United States that is not sustainable today, because we're not thinking about all the spaces in the middle and what we call the public realm in my field, right? So thinking about the streets and thinking about open space. These are not parts of the city that bring in income right away, and so they're often forgotten. But I think we're especially seeing it now. They're very essential to public health, right? We can't build streets just for cars. In some of the early days of town planning, and thinking about children especially, many towns in England and the United States there were people advocating for centering a town around the school, right? And you should only build as far as sort of the service area of the school. And of course, you could have several schools in the town now, but it should also be within walking distance. And I think about that a lot. There's a lot of children right now that can't walk to school, and it's not even because of stranger danger, right? But we're worried about cars, right? Fast moving cars, maybe cutting through their route. And then I also think we really have to think about green space and open spaces. In Boston, where I live now, open spaces have actually been very crowded to a point where it's not safe anymore, even though that's sort of the one outdoor activity that's allowed right now is to access the park. What's interesting is that if you look at the literature from the turn of the century, there were landscape architects and urban plannings advocating for exactly this, and that they said we can't just build and build, but we need to break up the density of cities and break up the density of towns with parks. Some people even called them the lungs of the city, right? It's just a little breathing space where you could get away and access nature. And so, ideally, I think a healthy town planning or city planning, and I think this applies at all scales, is basically a place where you can access all your services from grocery shopping and schools and community centers by walking or biking. Trying to separate fast-moving vehicles away from those places also, and also the equitable distribution of green space and open space in a neighborhood is really key in play spaces for children.
Mm-hmm. So you said that you have done some research specifically on playgrounds and play spaces. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What have you found?
I think it's fascinating because, we think of playgrounds as more or less just a nice amenity today, right? But the history of playgrounds is actually very political. If you think about the Industrial Revolution, there were children working in factories, which was very detrimental to children's health. There was a large campaign for child labor laws. After the child labor laws had passed, there were activists such as G. Stanley Hall and Henry Curtis, if anybody in the audience has heard of them. They were child psychologists, and they advocated for play because they were worried about children playing in the streets, right? And possibly being hit by cars, and also sort of worried about the vice that they would see in the streets. So building playgrounds in the United States in the early 1900s was actually very much a political movement, and there was a lot of a lot of documentation, a lot of advocacy around it. Jane Addams was one activist that was advocating for playgrounds, and especially advocating to build playgrounds in immigrant neighborhoods in Chicago, and they would find empty lots, and thinking about where were these spaces that children could congregate? And it's interesting because these early playgrounds were actually very, very utilitarian, right? They were basically a patch of dirt, a vacant lot, metal pipes, and chains. But these activists would watch the playgrounds, and they called them model playgrounds. And so they were looking at what kind of interventions sort of matched up with which kind of play, right? And what was the proper kind of play. Even Theodore Roosevelt said that playgrounds are necessary means for the development of wholesome citizenship in modern cities. And so the building of playgrounds is actually linked to what he believed were better civics. Wow. And they documented that in one district of Chicago that juvenile crime cases decreased almost 44% when they introduced a playground to that town. So it's very important. And although playgrounds are obviously a little bit off limits now because of the touching, playground equity and park equity is actually a very large issue that we see in a lot of cities today, right? Especially in socioeconomically disadvantaged neighborhoods. If you look at where playgrounds are, there's just not enough there. But building more playgrounds doesn't necessarily have to be expensive. There's a group called Learning Landscapes Alliance in Denver, and saw that physical activity increased after really relatively simple upgrades, like maybe a new structure or just paint on the ground, right? Can help guide that play and increase activity a little bit. And I think, you and I would know, or anybody who has definitely seen a progression in styles of playgrounds over the years, right? If from those dirt and metal pipes and chains, and perhaps you and I, we remember the hot metal slides of our of our youth, which you can't find anymore, right? Now we have more plastic and soft turf, and so I just find playground design really interesting. Again, not just because of the equity issue and the benefits that it can bring to a city, but also how does the design of playgrounds sort of reflect thinking about children and children's development of each era.
That's really fascinating. Let's dig in a little bit on park and playground equity, if you don't mind, because I read an editorial in the New York Times about 3 weeks ago now, where the Times was really taking Mayor de Blasio to task about the closure of playgrounds and parks and pools this summer, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious, from your perspective, how should mayors, for example, be mm-hmm. thinking about the balance this summer between public health
right.
and equity and access for children who are going to be in New York? They're going to, by that point, have been out of school almost 6 months. Mm-hmm. Hot summer, pools, playgrounds. Frankly, in a place like New York, those are places for a lot of kids to just be able to cool off and blow off right. energy and steam, right?
Right.
And one observation from the Times was that, the last year before New York had public pools, the drownings in the East River of kids just jumping into, were astronomical, right? So there's some other downstream, public health tragedies, frankly, that could be waiting for us if those parks and playgrounds are not open. So how should mayors be thinking about this issue this summer?
Yeah, I think, I wouldn't profess to tell any mayor how to run their city. And obviously people have to balance a lot of concerns right now, but just, thinking about how I think you can already see it in many places across the United States. As the weather gets nicer, people have been locked down for 2 months now, and people are starting to go out anyway. And so I think, closing open space is only going to exacerbate the issue. You're going to see people sneaking into them everywhere. As you mentioned, a really tragic example is maybe people going where it's not safe just to access those play facilities. And so, I think we'll see hopefully an opening up of those public spaces, but maybe more policing of it, which is, that's a hard line to broach. And how do you keep people from distancing away from each other? But I think, at least to get through this initial summer and how long we're going through it, I would look at the spaces that we're not using now in cities due to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And Oakland and New York City, possibly Boston now, and other towns have been closing down their streets because people aren't commuting in anymore, and they've been keeping them as pedestrian or biking streets. Also thinking about parking lots, right? That there's probably there's probably too much parking in most American cities. And if there's people not using them right now, let's think about how they can be flexible spaces, right? So how can you bring in maybe temporary splash pads, right? Or piping or something like that. And it's also a good opportunity to sort of test out these spaces and see, again, what kind of changes should be permanent post-pandemic, and to get ready for future pandemics when we really need more of the public realm and a place where we can interact socially while still maintaining the safe physical distancing. So I don't know, that would be my first recommendation is what's not being used now.
Thank you. That's helpful. I just want to remind everyone that you can submit a question in the Q&A tab in the chat box. We will be taking your questions. Would love to hear from you. Sara, the public realm. I love this phrase drawn from architecture and the built environment and urban planning and that sort of thing. And one of the things that has really concerned me over maybe the last decade or so is, frankly, the loss of the public, right? And you think there's been work done recently on the luxury economy, how more and more we're able to pay for increasing degrees of privacy. When we fly, you can pay enough that nobody will see you, or these sorts of things. And I'm just curious how we might think about, first of all, if you agree with that, the loss of the public, and then secondly, how we might think about reclaiming the public. And maybe this pandemic and what you were just saying is actually an opportunity to reclaim those things that are public, that are common, that maybe have been increasingly privatized, or at least, if not officially privatized, sort of privatized de facto.
Yeah, I really hope what this pandemic shows the powers that be is that an investment in the public realm is an investment in public health, right? And again, you're not going to bring in sort of the capital right away, but we have to look at the long-term benefits of it. And it's not only for pandemics like this, but adding green and open space to cities. It's good for what we call social cohesion, right? Or knowing the people that live in your neighborhood that you can network out to in case of another crisis. Turning more places into green space helps combat the effects we'll feel from climate change, right? As towns and cities get warmer and warmer, if we plant more trees, if we have more parks, it will keep it a little bit cooler. I think you hit on a really key point that maybe not enough people are talking about. And I know in a lot of cities, right, that office buildings say you can build higher if you build a public space. But there was a really great study in San Francisco that showed a lot of these buildings that got that waiver or allowance on their buildings were putting their public space maybe in the second floor of a lobby that you had to enter anyway, right? So that's sort of the most egregious privatization of public space. While I think there had been a lot of, and again, I'm just talking about sort of my particular area of research, which is looking at landscapes and looking at these public realm landscapes. While I think the quality of spaces in cities has become like much more innovative, and definitely we see great examples of high design there. There's still not enough concentration on how they're distributed in a city. And again, just mapping it, right? And looking at our distribution of the public realm and looking at the quality of it, right? Like, does somebody have a basketball court, but is it right underneath, say, a freeway in a neighborhood? That's not conducive to public health. And just because you put it there doesn't mean it's contributing to public health at all. And so I think what I had explored in my research was really looking at this time, which was up until vaccines in the early 20th century, where urban planning and public health and city management all worked together as one and coordinated with each other. Those departments and those fields were very much split apart after vaccines, because it was thought that anything that we could, any kind of illness that would face the developed world could be addressed by vaccines. And of course, COVID-19, one day there is going to be a vaccine for COVID-19. But in the meantime, we really do have to think about the environmental conditions that exacerbate these diseases. And we have to think about how the built environment influences social behavior. That could also exacerbate the disease. And that's why I think it's really important to think about, where people can commune safely, where they can recreate safely, or else nobody's going to conform to the guidelines that they've put out. You can't stay in your home forever, especially if you're, say, in an apartment building, right, with no access to the outdoors.
Let's talk for a minute about work from home. Mm-hmm. And this week, Jack Dorsey, the CEO and co-founder of Twitter, announced that Twitter employees will be able to work from home permanently. Mm-hmm. There's no expectation that they will have to come back. So this raises, of course, an interesting question for urban designers, economic developers, and others. What are we going to do with the office space?
Yeah, I think that's the first front.
that are attached to it?
Yeah. Again, I think people, I think a lot of people sort of, jump on one possible trend they see and think, well, is it going to transform everything? And the fact is, it's not going to transform everything, right? But it's definitely going to make a blip, and it's going to change. It's going to shift, right? It will shift the thinking of how we think about working. I think the trend in working from home, one of my colleagues at Northeastern put it really well, where she said, that was a change that was maybe 10 years in the making anyway, right? It was going to happen over time. The thing is, it just got compressed into, well, a month, right?
Right.
Everybody switched from working in offices to working at home. And so I that'll definitely be the first front of the environment that we see changing from flexible work hours, right, to allowing more people to work from home. And sort of the ripple effect from that is it going to change what people look for in houses and real estate, right? Are you going to be looking for a house that has a dedicated office space now? And so I think we'll see those changes, and we should be aware of them. We probably won't see the actual built changes of them for maybe 5 years, maybe even 10 years. But I think another thing we have to think about is, in San Francisco, and I used to live in the Bay Area, and I remember when Twitter moved in, and they moved into mid-market, which was a very, I don't know, sort of empty, like not great stretch of San Francisco in the first place. And there was a lot of talk about how they were going to revive the neighborhood. It didn't really happen. Again, they put sort of a obligatory public space gallery on the first floor, but it didn't really feel like a public space. But at the same time, a lot of these tech companies moving in, and again, I'm just using San Francisco as an example, it also made cities very unaffordable, right? You had the people moving in there, everybody was looking for real estate at the same time. And so again, if we think about the move from to working remotely and people living elsewhere, there might be a benefit there if it sort of rebalances towards who can afford to live in the city. So that might be a positive, but with any sort of like immediate downturn, we just have to kind of balance that against not cleaving the inequities that were already present there even further. And so I think it's interesting, and I think on a macro scale, we have to think about those issues. On a micro scale, offices will be the first to probably see an introduction of touchless technologies, right? Changes in ventilation systems, and so that particular sector of the built environment definitely will be really interesting to see.
Thank you. You said, used the phrase, it was public space, but it didn't feel like public space. Yeah. What, from a designer, architect's perspective, right? Yeah. What do you have to do? What are the features of a space that is public that actually feels like public space? Because I've certainly been in public spaces where if I were not a white man, I would be suspect being
exactly. Yeah. Well, an interesting example here is to think about early 20th century parks, many that were built by Frederick Law Olmsted, who, interestingly enough, was a landscape architect, but actually had training as a public health official. He was a sanitary commissioner for New York State for a long time. And so if you read his writings about public space and parks, they're very much influenced by health. But also, he was an abolitionist and believed very strongly that that people of all socioeconomic classes should be able to use his spaces. And so, if you think about the design features of Central Park, it is in the middle of the city, right? It touches many, many parts of the city. So you can enter it from many angles, from many different neighborhoods, right? That's a big part of it. I think the issue in San Francisco, when we think about these, and there's actually a term for it, it's called privately owned public spaces, or POPOs. Somebody did a really great map of them. When it's in a building, right, and you have to cross that threshold, and you have the sense that maybe you're being surveilled in some way, or maybe even that you have to purchase something to be there. And I'm just thinking about, Starbucks and coffee shops, right, are also often seen as public spaces, but there's still somewhat of a barrier of entry for people to feel welcome there. Then that starts to close in sort of who is welcome to be there. If we're thinking about putting more public space back in cities, so obviously a park is the first example, but think about what kind of activities do you allow for in a park, right? Do you have a playground, but also do you have space for barbecues, right? Do you have space for soccer? Do you have space for basketball? Designing the public realm is always community specific, and it should always be done with the community in mind, not to the community. I think that's a phrase somewhere. So you need to draw inspiration from the people that live there, as well as the site, and that's what really makes for an inclusive public space.
Beautiful, thank you. We have some questions coming in now, and please, everyone, keep them coming. Mika asks, are there examples of pop-up parks created during the pandemic? So not only street closures for cyclists and pedestrians, but pop-up parks as places perhaps for lingering. And if yes, where might those have been implemented?
So I need to keep a better track of that. I'm sure there have been somewhere, right? And maybe even if it's just a neighborhood that's, and I saw some cities are asking people to write in to ask, right, if you want your street closed now and in the future. I think it's in Seattle. I think in Seattle you can submit that. And so I haven't seen any pop-up social spaces. There was a really interesting trend in urbanism, maybe started about 12 years ago, of taking over parking spaces and what we call parklets. And we see a lot of them in the Bay Area, some of them in Honolulu, where I lived before Boston, where people were, especially restaurants and other shops, were maybe taking over one parking space and actually transforming it into a little park with seating, right, and a table or a space just to sit. And so while again, I don't know of an example of a pop-up park yet, if you look up the term parklet, you'll see lots of innovative sort of, some temporary and some have become permanent because they've been able to convince the Department of Transportation that these should be permanent public spaces and not a parking space anymore. And I think we can look to that particular trend to think about how we transform some of this infrastructure permanently after the pandemic has passed. Great,
that's helpful. Could you imagine changes to cities and communities if we no longer use congregate care arrangements for elder care because it maybe is not safe from a virus perspective? And how would the built environments need to change to accommodate older citizens in more multi-generational contexts?
I find this question fascinating. So as I just mentioned, I taught at University of Hawaii in Honolulu for 4 years before I moved to Boston just a couple years ago. And because I was known as the health and built environment professor at the school, there were a lot of students that would come in and for their thesis project, I mean, more so than any school I've been to before, a lot of students picked as their thesis project, they wanted to address elderly housing. And a lot of that has to do with the culture in Hawaii. You're thinking a lot of, you have a lot of Asian families, you have a lot of mixed Asian and Hawaiian families, and intergenerational or multi-generational households is just really ingrained in the culture. I think in much of the United States, though, it's not the same. But it was really great to see these young people that were very concerned with addressing this issue and thinking about how they could keep their grandmothers and grandfathers with the family for a long time. So the issue you have in Honolulu, and I think this is the same in a lot of cities and towns, is that the real estate is very expensive. And the example I would turn a lot of these students to is a rising trend in what we call accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, which is, or maybe you think of it as like an in-law house, right? So can you build a small structure that's actually on your property? The issue with that is in a lot of cities and towns, the zoning actually doesn't allow for it because, if you build an ADU, sometimes you need an extra parking, you need to build an extra parking space to go with it, which obviously doesn't apply if it's maybe just your grandmother or grandfather living there. And so again, ADUs could be very helpful for multi-generational housing. It could be useful for offices, right, as people work from homes. And so rethinking how the home is built and maybe thinking about, the size of things. But what has to change before any of that is allowed is the zoning and the parking requirements in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's no built environment intervention will change without massive cultural shifts
Right.
as well. And also just a more equitable healthcare system and thinking about healthcare that maybe comes to the home and doesn't have to be centralized in a
Sure.
care home.
So, on that, architects, any number of people from different disciplines are downstream of culture.
Right.
And I'm curious in your work and writing, how you might think about, or how we might think about the influence that architects can have back upstream to influence culture in these directions that we now know are aligned for health, for flourishing, for all of it in the context of the city and frankly small towns as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's an issue. Is that most of architecture and landscape architecture is really beholden to private clients, right, and instead of public, and sort of indicative of just a larger disinvestment in our public realm and public services in general. But I think the one power that designers have, and this is what I always tell my students, right, when they say, well, this is never going to be built, like I'm just what's sometimes they get a little bit downtrodden and they say, what's the point? And I keep telling them, I'm like, the power you have as designers is visualization, right, as sort of synthesizing a lot of these social issues and visualizing them into a built environment intervention, right? And so even if it's imaginary, this is an exercise for you in thinking about site requirements and social issues, the needs of a site, and really putting it all in one project. And everybody, architecture, I think sometimes we see architecture as like this very insular field, but the fact is everybody has feelings on architecture and
Mm-hmm.
landscape architecture. Everybody experiences the built environment in some way. And I really encourage, at least my students to think about that interaction between the public and what they're doing. Okay, so think about like how they would really use this and what are you addressing here?
Yeah, wonderful. Just a reminder that we are still taking your questions. If you have one that you would like to ask, please use the Q&A function in the chat box. I would like to actually maybe go back a little bit to your own history and experience as an architect. What drove you to become an architect and then to become a teacher?
So I had a long and circuitous journey to this particular point in time, as I'm sure many people have in their life. But I don't know. I wanted to go to art school when I was in high school, and my dad thought I should be an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
So architecture was the compromise. Yeah.
Bringing those things together.
Yeah. So it seemed fair enough, and I totally understand that he wanted me to have a job after I graduated, and I just I ended up loving it. So I went to architecture school in New Orleans at Tulane University, and after I graduated, this is actually the origins of the book. I kind of ended up doing work in the healthcare realm. So I was working on rehabilitation units, some inpatient psychiatric units, hospital gardens, which I was really interested in, and operating rooms across the Gulf South. So I was living in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit. And I evacuated the city for about 6 weeks, and then I came back because there were no operational hospitals in New Orleans at that point. And so our clients wanted us to get health facilities back online as soon as possible. And so I was back in New Orleans. There were no children there at the time. If you think about, everybody else had to find other schooling for their children for a year. And I would just walk around the city, and I was also sitting in on a lot of community planning meetings instead, sitting in on a lot of conversations, thinking about how the city would be rebuilt. And that's what really ended up on sort of my second career path, which was in landscape architecture, because I thought, I was doing all this work on hospitals, but I was thinking about the parks and the streets, and how all of that had been transformed in the wake of the hurricane. And that was actually like our most public resource, right? And then thinking about how it really did, how did it affect the social cohesion and the health of people that were living there at the time. And so that's what led me to get a degree in landscape architecture and then a PhD in environmental planning. And the PhD was mostly, I had two professors that said, you would be a good teacher, but you need a PhD if you're going to teach at the college level. But it was great because the PhD allowed me to really delve into this research on specifically health and the built environment, and the history of it, and thinking about how past epidemics had influenced the urban landscape that we inhabit today.
So you're an architect, a landscape designer, an environmental planner, and frankly also an historian, given
yeah, I got an accidental historian. I don't want to offend any real historians that are listening. That's a very that's a very rigorous profession, and I would not claim to be a historian, although I think they just called me that on history.com. But I think, and I always thought this even when I was practicing, is that we need to know the history of place, and we need to know the history of how we got there if we're going to think about how we design intelligently for the future, because we don't want to make those same mistakes. So I'm an accidental historian in the interest of not making the same mistakes in the future.
Great. We have a question here about Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre city as a model for the moment. Suburban, not urban, but maybe some thoughts on its relevance for today.
Yeah, Broadacre City is wild. So Frank Lloyd Wright thought we'd all be traveling around in personal helicopters at this point, and so that would spur on a sort of a massive decentralization of the city. So obviously we're not there yet, but there are ideas in Broadacre City that I think are occurring in the conversation today. And basically, what is the value of being more self-sufficient, right? So Broadacre City was about personal plots of land and personal agriculture. And that's an idea that, again, as the city has been demonized as an incubator of disease, people like Frank Lloyd Wright and Ebenezer Howard, even Thomas Jefferson, have thought that everybody should be more self-sufficient, right? Mm-hmm. And just farm your own land. It doesn't matter how far you have to travel. I think what we're seeing today, though, the reality for most people is that their jobs are still centralized in a city or town somewhere, depending on where they live, and that's not going to go away for a while, no matter the shift in working from home, and commuting, by vehicle, not by personal helicopter, can be a real detriment to physical and mental health. Mm-hmm. And so, while I think Frank Lloyd Wright, and I think what this shows is like that rhetoric has occurred over and over again over decades, that everybody's going to leave the city, right. That rural places are healthier, that we just need to be more self-sufficient. And the fact is, it's just, the nature of our economy today. It doesn't make it feasible for a large number of people. It's great to look at, though. It's wild to look at. I love looking at it.
Yeah, and just to follow up to that, from a historical perspective, I mean, certainly the in the American lore, rural places are healthier. They are seed beds of good citizenship, right? Mm-hmm. And there's anti-immigrant sentiment tied up in that. There's racist sentiment tied up in that. But I'm curious, like, just purely from a health sciences perspective, right?
Mhm.
Are rural places healthier than cities? Like, is there, historically speaking, is there any sort of evidence to suggest that that might actually be true from a public health perspective?
So I think what's important to realize is, in our particular era, and again, like this is all research that has been done pre-pandemic, and
Mhm.
so we don't actually know the association between, say, density and disease transmission, although that's been a recurring argument in the news right now. But it depends what metrics of health you're looking at, and also thinking about that health is very personal. And the health issues we were dealing with before the pandemic and the health issues we will deal with after the pandemic are long lasting chronic issues, like, say, diseases that come from obesity or mental health, right? And while rural places you might have more access to fresh air and you can move around, you may be more socially isolated, right? Which is not great for mental health. Um, you could live in a city and have lots of access and maybe move around more during the day, but you may be subject to, say, more air pollution, right? And so a lot of most of our health outcomes today, they are formed by where you live, but more than anything else, they're formed by socioeconomic status, and
Mm,
it's formed by your access to healthcare more
sure.
than anything. So there are many different ways that you can sort of shake down the metrics of health, and it just depends on what particular health outcome you're looking at. And so health is multifaceted, it's political, it's
Right.
it means a lot of things these days, and not just the absence of disease, right, as the World Health Organization put it.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Good. Question here. Given the inequitable life chances, opportunities, and outcomes of Indigenous peoples, peoples of color, persons with disabilities, LGBTQ, and other equity seeking groups in historically disadvantaged communities, how do we best design intelligently to include the needed and targeted policies, programs, and investments that redress long existing and very real inequities and disparities?
Yeah, I mean, the
There's probably a book in that too. So
yes, yeah, no, there definitely is, and there has been some great research written about it too. I'm just thinking, off the top of my head, Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, if you haven't read it, but that's a very powerful book that talks about the legacy of redlining in the United States, and how a lot of these redline communities, people have stayed there because their families are there and they built a community there, but they're also more subject to environmental justice issues such as asthma, right? And there was a study that came out from University of California a couple years ago that showed these red line neighborhoods. The children there had higher rates of asthma, right? They had they're hotter, right, in the face of climate change. I think mistakes that have been made in the past, if we're thinking about just strictly built environment or urban planning decisions, is that people have noticed these inequities in health, and they have thought the solution is just to move people to other neighborhoods, say more affluent neighborhoods. And that can have very detrimental health effects if you displace somebody from a community. Like, it may be, on surface, what you might think of as an unhealthy community, but you may be tearing away the one bit of social connection and social cohesion that they have there. And so I think, and again, this is purely coming from a built environment and design standpoint. I think the best thing we can do is concentrate our resources in improving those communities, and not on sort of the next, I think, as you put it, sort of next luxury landscape, right? Sort of the big sort of showpiece um, park or building or complex, and working with the people, like understanding what they want, right? Sometimes these changes aren't always physical, but you have to understand people's what are their social activities, and what their real needs are. And so I think redesigning in place and with the buy-in of the community is really important uh, to address. And again, this is just from an architecture and landscape architecture standpoint. Obviously, there are far more detrimental issues of economic inequity and healthcare policy that's also affecting them. But I don't know, that's where I hope we go after the pandemic, because these health inequities are also they're showing up again, and it's not the I think in the United States, unfortunately, we tend to blame people that are sick, right? That they must have done something to get sick. And the fact is, the pandemic is just another pile-on of environmental injustices, of climate change events, and other health inequities that have been piled on these communities. And it's not because of where they live, right? It's because we sort of conscribe them to live there, and they don't have access to the same amenities.
Great. I have two more questions for you.
Sure.
The first question is about the relationship of cities with food and food producing areas. And obviously, it's been in the news over the last couple of weeks about our meat packing industry, meat shortages in particular, but also supply chain issues globally, right?
Right.
And so, I'm just curious to get your thoughts around the relationship of cities with food producing areas, and the need to maintain strong supply chains between them and connections. And then also, what is the responsibility both of city people to farm areas, and then also about the production of food within cities themselves?
Yeah, so this actually is also a personal question to me, because I come from a cattle ranching family in western South Dakota, so they are part of that supply chain. They're at the very beginning of it, and I know people from where I grew up. There's been a lot of anxiety around what's happening right now, because they know they're producing the food, but it's something that's so out of their control, that somewhere in the supply chain and the processing, that they see the shortages, which can shift the prices. And for a long time too, there's been a threat from overseas meat and food and supplies, right, that are really detrimental to our American farms. I think it's interesting because this is coming from somebody who grew up on a cattle ranch and then moved to a city and saw how disconnected people in the city are from those supply chains, and also being in a field where there's a lot of excitement over urban agriculture, which I think is great, like on surface, right? Especially teaching people how to grow their own food, to thinking about how can some of our landscapes be more productive and more useful, and how can you localize some things. But the fact is you're never going to produce enough food in the city to feed the people in the city, right? And so you need that connection to rural areas. And so I think the best thing that people in the city can do is to understand these supply chains more, think about how we need to keep the supply chains in the United States. And I also think there's like a strange valorization of the family farm, but only done. And this is coming from an urban standpoint, and this is just again from having lived in the city for many years. But people are actually very unaware of the processes and the risk it takes to run a family farm, and there's many other steps in the supply chain that are that separate you from the family farm. And on the same end, that it's almost impossible for a family farm to sell direct to survive just selling direct to other people, right? That you need the larger suppliers. And so I think being educated on it, thinking about how our rural landscapes, how do you bring back farming? How do you teach people to farm? I mean, this is something that's usually ingrained in families in centuries. I think, as much as people would like to talk about how local their food chains are, very many people actually know where, say, their meat or their produce comes from. And so to understand that whole cycle is maybe the first thing we can do.
Yeah, helpful. Thank you. And then my last question, which I like to ask everybody I have a conversation with, what is a project that you've dreamed about but haven't started yet?
My house.
Perfectly fair answer.
Yeah, this is so we moved to the suburb in Boston 2 years ago. This is the first time my husband and I have owned a house, just because we've moved around so much for the past few years. And the irony is we're both architects, so we bought a 1950 Cape house to restore. But we also have 3 children, ages 6 and under. So, and especially now that they're home all the time, any renovation plans have been put off for a while. But I've dreamed for a long time of actually getting to design my own house and design my own garden. And so we're here. We're almost there. We just have to wait this particular period out a little bit, and then we can get serious about it. Yeah. As you can see from my lovely unfinished wall paneling behind me.
Well, thank you for that very honest and candid answer.
Yeah.
Most people are not that quick with their response. So.
Yeah, since we've been here for 2 months straight, obviously I've been thinking about all the things I want to do around here.
Yeah. Good. Well, Sara Jensen Carr, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and thanks to everybody who joined us. We will post the recording here in the next 24 hours or so, so please feel free to share it, and we look forward to staying in touch with all of you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Joe. Bye.